Well, hello, everybody. I am Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and I'm really excited about this Zoom event that we're having today on a really important topic and a topic that I learned a lot about in these last few months while editing these. I often say my favorite thing about being the editor of Democracy Journal is the stuff I learned while editing these articles by smart people. And this was no different in this instance. About the relationship between democracy and technology. We're calling this panel Protecting Democracy in the Digital Age. And I would say we at the Journal thought of this idea some time ago, and then through a couple of serendipitous little moves, I was told that I should get in touch with Alexandra Givens. And I did, and she was very instrumental in helping us put this together and helping us find some of these great contributors who you're going to be hearing from today. I just want to say the last thing, I just want to throw in a little plug for democracy before we get started. If you don't know the journal, I hope you'll check it out, democracyjournal.org. A quarterly journal, broadly progressive in its viewpoint, with a lot of deep dives into policy questions that a lot of other places aren't really thinking about. And we're proud of the work we've done over the years in a lot of areas on economics and social policy and many aspects of domestic policy. So please look at the journal, and thank you for joining us today. And that's it from me. And right now I am going to toss it to Issie Lapowsky. Issie is a journalist who has been covering these issues, technology and politics, for many years, lately for Protocol and Wired. So enjoy the show, and Issie, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am really excited to be here with this all-star panel. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to introduce our panelists and then kick it over to them to tell them a little bit about the essays they wrote for the most recent issue of Democracy before we dive into questions. We're also going to take some audience questions. So if you have any, and please do, feel free to add them to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. All right, so let's dive in. These are our panelists in no particular order. We have Suresh Venkatasubramanian, Director of the Center for Tech Responsibility at Brown University. Thanks for being here, Suresh. We have Alex Givens, President and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology. We have Tom Wheeler, former chair of the FCC and a visiting fellow at Brookings. And we have Claire Wardle, co-director of the Information Futures Lab, also at Brown University. Big Brown contingent today. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So, Alex, your essay sort of tees up the other pieces in the issue. So I thought maybe it would be great if you kicked it off, telling us a little bit about your piece, which focuses on the democratic digital age.
Sure. Thanks so much, Issie, and thanks to the Democracy team for hosting us today. It really was an honor to collaborate on this volume. And I think the way that I'll tee it up is by saying that I come to tech policy not as a technologist at all, but from a deep commitment to human rights and social justice. And I really believe that if you care about democracy in 2023, you have to know about and care about technology policy. And that's the genesis of this volume that we were pursuing this year. Whether it's voting rights, supporting informed and trustworthy elections, think about economic mobility, racial justice, bodily autonomy, all of those issues that are so core to a democracy, technology is deeply centered and transforming each of those spaces. So at my nonprofit, the Center for Democracy and Technology, that's exactly what we work on every day. And one of the core things that we think about is how we get a bigger tent of people who are impacted, of people who work on these issues, participating in tech policy conversations, not taking themselves out of it because they don't understand the tech, but instead realizing that we need to be having across society dialogue about how technology is transforming society and social opportunity. So it was phenomenal that this volume tees up so many of those different topics, and I'm glad we'll get a chance to talk about them a little bit more today. In my essay, I sought to highlight several ways in which technology is impacting democracy today, both domestically and globally. And again, that's everything from civic discourse to personal privacy to economic mobility, racial justice, and more. But despite this being a volume largely focused on US domestic policy, I actually thought it was important to open with an example of how authoritarian regimes are leveraging technology around the world to crack down on dissent. Sadly, I could have selected from any number of options, but the story I told was how we're seeing technology weaponized for suppression in Iran, particularly after the protests that were sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, who was the 22-year-old who was arrested by Iran's morality police last September for allegedly improperly wearing the hijab. For months, we all saw this. Many saw the powerful footage of protesters and reporting, too, that went into detail about the lengths people had to go to share that footage safely with the outside world. There was this wonderful report on the BBC talking about how a reporter was connecting with protesters at the scene to send video out via encrypted messaging, helping them then hide their tracks after the fact to try and conceal their identity as they tried to shed a light on what was happening. Despite that, Iran has been very upfront about the ways in which it's using technology to surveil and stop dissent. So, for example, and I list some of these in the piece, after attending protests, demonstrators have received text messages from local police cautioning them not to show up in other demonstrations, showing them that they were being watched and tracked and that the police knew how to get directly in touch with them via text. We've seen organizers describing authorities hacking into their social media accounts to read their private messages and even to trap allies through impersonation. In September, some of the listeners might remember this, Iran announced that it was going to use face recognition to detect and identify women in public who were not correctly wearing the hijab. And a member of parliament even went so far as to say that women who dress improperly would receive text message warnings, followed by automatic penalties, such as their bank accounts being blocked. Although the regime walked back some of those statements, and we haven't seen them all play out, we're talking about a country where citizens are required to use biometric national identity cards to access the internet, to receive pensions, receive food rations. And so this connection of the digital surveillance state, how easy it is to silence dissent and weaponize programs that people need to survive because of technology, is just a really important learning moment for all of us. One of the things that mattered to me about raising this in this place was that oftentimes, both on the government side and then even amongst advocates and on civil society, we often silo these conversations, right? You either talk about domestic tech policy or you work on international human rights and democracy. And one of the things I think about and worry about is we can't afford to silo those conversations in this digital age when norms are still evolving in every country about how we think of the governance of technology. And of course, when tech is often actually developed in the US or aligned democratic nations that can then be used and misused around the world. So as we think about the domestic agenda on tech policy, which is some of the things other panelists will discuss and we'll go into in the Q&A, we have to build an affirmative vision for democratic governance, one that's grounded in human rights and democratic values and can help carry our values not only at home, but also around the world. The last thing I'll say briefly is that there are smart people in government who really get this, but as a nation, we have to do more to rise to this moment. It's telling, for example, that when the US government recently hosted the Summit for Democracy Year 2, the event that they chose to host in the US as our signature event was the one on democracy and technology. You had Secretary Blinken speak from the stage about the domestic work that the US has done on AI. I was lucky enough to host a panel with the European Vice President talking about AI policy and how we think about tying domestic and international conversations. But there's still so much to be done, right? The US doesn't even have a basic federal privacy law. We point to Iran's surveillance tactics or China's abusive use of policing technology, and yet can't even have a full discussion in Congress or in the executive branch around law enforcement use of technology in the US. So this is a really important moment with a lot of work to be done. And it's wonderful that democracy is highlighting this and that hopefully so many more people are ready to join the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alex. So since you brought up AI policy, I'm going to kick it to you, Suresh, because that's sort of the focus of your essay.
Thanks, Issie, and thanks a lot to Michael and the Democracy Journal for having us at this panel here today. Just by way of background, I like to tell people I'm a card-carrying computer scientist. It's important in many ways, but I'd like to say that up front. I've spent many years in the trenches doing computer science research that has nothing for a while had nothing to do with many of the issues we face today. But over the years, as my work has shifted, as the impact of the work I do has been felt more and more in society, I've spent more and more time thinking about the intersection or the collisions between technology and society. And in that role, I worked with civil society organizations like the ACLU. I worked with state and local governments. And then, of course, I spent time in the White House helping as part of a team drafting the blueprint for AI Bill of Rights. Now, of course, I'm at Brown directing a Center for Tech Responsibility. I think that's where kind of my essay starts. So my essay is sort of a reflection. The title is Repairing the Algorithmic Lens, but it's a reflection on computer science as a discipline itself. Alex mentioned, that she's now a technologist, and it's important that people understand technology. I couldn't agree more, but from the other side of it, that technologists need to understand how our field, the field that we created, is now shaping society in ways that we probably weren't really prepared for. Computer science, I grew up with the internet. I grew up, when Yahoo was just a series of bookmarks on Jerry Yang's webpage at Stanford. That dates me, but it is true. But I grew up seeing the internet become the web, and the web become social media, the social media become AI and everything we see today. And it was a surreal experience being a computer science through this time, because we used to joke that you do computer science if you don't want to talk to people. That's why you go into computer science. And yet the very field that was very inward driven, very focused on itself, very focused on the nature of computation as a physical thing, became something that could speak or claim to speak to how society should be structured. And this happens slowly and then very quickly. For a while, we, especially with machine learning and the growth of large data collections and then larger compute power and deep learning and what have you, we slowly began to imagine that computer science or algorithms could decide or could predict or could understand behaviors of people, of communities, of societies. It's almost as if we were creating a new lens, this algorithmic lens through which we were looking at the world and interpreting everything in the world. It became commonplace, even though people weren't reflecting on this, to say, if I don't know the answer to this question, I'll just throw a bunch of data into an algorithm and see what it comes up with, as if the algorithm were the method by which we pursue truth in the world. And this has, of course, had many consequences. Unfortunately, many of them problematic consequences, because the algorithmic lens does not, in fact, just uncritically given data and given ways to model it, speak to the needs of humans, of people in society. It has distortions, it has biases, it has problems with the way it collects data, and all the ways that we've been documenting over the years. And it became clear at some point through the work of journalists, the work of advocates, the work of activists, the work of civil society and academics, that we had to correct the way this lens was operating. We had to do something about it. And so one part of my work, and being a computer scientist, I had not sort of strayed into policy that much, but slowly started getting into how should we be trying to rebuild or reimagine the way we do technology in a way that's more harmonious with how we want to live. The first part of that, of course, is guardrails, is guidelines, things like the blueprint, things like risk management frameworks, things like the AI Act, things like other legislation that we'd like to have, and regulations to help protect us from the worst excesses of technology in society. We do this with virtually every other advanced technology. We did this with food, we did this with drugs, we did this with cars, we did this with planes. At some point, unfortunately, we had to wait for people to die before we decided it was time to do something about these technologies. People are already being harmed, and I'm hopeful we don't have to wait till we have much more cataclysmic outcomes. But we do need to have the same kinds of protections now that we did for all the other advanced technologies to make sure that we can use them safely. And that's sort of the first part of what my reflection, my essay is, and what that looks like, right? How we put those guardrails in place. But again, as now an academic again, as a computer scientist, I reflect on my field itself and where we may have gone astray, and how we can begin to reimagine and redesign the way we do computer science, the way we build technology, so that we don't have these problems occurring again and again. And that means many things. It means not letting the technology be the central focus, allowing people to take center stage as we should, and understanding how we use technology to support us and help us rather than trying to fit ourselves into machine readable formats that can be read by algorithms. But to do that requires us to reimagine the very questions at the core of how we do computer science. And now that I'm back at Brown trying to educate sort of the next few generations of computer scientists, this is what I think about. How do we change the questions, the very structure of our discipline to be more understanding and more receptive to the way that our technologies need to be used and want to be used by people, so that they can actually help us flourish, they can help us be whoever we want to be, they can help us be our own selves, and they can help us express ourselves in all our wondrous sort of humanness, if you wish. And especially with things like, and I have to say it, ChatGPT and other generative AI systems coming out right now, I think these questions are extremely urgent and they're extremely important, and I'm very glad we're having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Claire, I think I'll have you go next, since your essay is part and parcel of this conversation about AI, misinformation, disinformation, all of that. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be part of this panel. I think when I wrote this, you sort of read it, you never know whether you're going to get a chance to talk about it, or even if anybody did really, other than your mum. So this is really nice to have this chat. So I have been thinking about questions around how do people know what's true for the last decade. I started doing a lot of work on user-generated content back in sort of 2008 with the BBC, who were saying the audience is sending us things and we don't know what's true. But I think Suresh started thinking about all the different chapters that we're having, and they've been very condensed. We're now in a place where I've been working deeply on the issue of misinformation. We can talk a little bit about definitions in a second. And so my essay kind of started with a little bit of a Debbie Downer, which is, I feel like a lot of money has been thrown at this problem. We've had a lot of conferences, we've had a lot of chats. But if we actually look at where we are, I'd say that things are worse and they haven't got better. And I think we can recognize that when a field is new, it often does have an influx of money. And when that happens, there often isn't a lot of structure and people are just trying to throw spaghetti at the wall. All of this has also happened at some very difficult times politically. Not only have we had surprising election results, we've had insurrections, we've had pandemics, we've had a reckoning with racial justice. All of this has happened at the same time as we've been trying to figure out this field. But in my essay, I was trying to just kind of have a reckoning of where we are and what are the kind of structures that we need to, as we move forward, think potentially differently about the problem. And so in the essay, I started by saying that we don't have a technical infrastructure. So for those of us who are spending a lot of time in the armpits of the internet, as I like to say, we actually have fewer tools now than we ever have. And a tool like CrowdTangle that's owned by Meta, we're all kind of waiting for the day that that's about to disappear. It's kind of astonishing that the tools that we do have, things like Meltwater, are owned by private companies that are built for brands to look at brand uplift, not looking at the toxicity of information online. So kind of the failings of a technical infrastructure is something I worry about deeply. And I'm sure we'll talk about the Digital Services Act that's coming out of Brussels, and there's lots of excitement about it. I think if you talk to anybody in Brussels, it's very easy to write the promises, but actually the logistics of what does it look like if we're going to share data with researchers? Like, honestly, what does the platform look like? We don't have that. So despite all of the money that has been spent in this area, the absence of a shared platform for doing this kind of work, for sharing interoperability around our own databases. If you think about all the people that have done this research separately, we can't share our results. They all sit in our own Slack channels and our own Google Sheets and other bespoke databases. So even at that level, I worry. We don't have a good methodological framework. The lab at the Information Futures Lab that I co-direct, we're about to publish a new literature review on 50 interventions around COVID misinformation. And so we were really excited that at the end of this big literature review, we'd have a real sense of what worked and what didn't. But when you've got different researchers, some people testing whether something, gargling with water was the example they used, whereas other people used examples of, is Bill Gates microchipping you? You can't compare apples and oranges when we don't have that. We're all using very different definitions of what we mean by misinformation, conspiracy, rumors. We don't have one shared definition. So in fact, when you start looking at the field, we don't actually have a good enough basis to say that we know what works or not. Every conclusion says we need more research, but we're not connecting the dots. Researchers tend to be competitive because we're all going for different types of money. So even at that level, without a shared understanding of this and what we're trying to achieve moving forward, if the achievement is, can I publish in a journal that nobody's going to read, no offense, that's not actually helping when we've got lots of people in the field saying, I need to know what the evidence base is. Another point I make in my essay is there is incredible work happening globally by practitioners in the field who are working directly with people. Maybe they're fact checkers or they're journalists or they're working with communities. They're doing all sorts of innovative things, but we're not really evaluating what's working and what's not. So if we think about media literacy, which at the beginning, back in 2016, 17, you'd say media literacy at conferences and people are like, oh, that's going to take too long. Can't we just tweak the Facebook algorithm? And of course, we've learned that that's not the case. And now when we think about what we know about literacy, all sorts of syllabi and curriculum globally, but no joined up thinking about what works and what doesn't. So it's hard again to look at all of the work, but the failure to join up and evaluate what's working. We don't have ethical and transparency frameworks for this work. So I've spent a lot of time in newsrooms. Newsrooms have very strong ethical codes, but in this space, who's funding what, who's sharing data with what, who's sitting around the table, who isn't sitting around the table. I often make jokes about going to convenings and Barbara, the librarian, is sitting next to Chad from the CIA. When is counter messaging propaganda in its own right? There's a whole host of ethical questions in terms of this space. And I think we rushed so quickly here, we didn't think through some of those challenges. And I think that idea, or the failing to do that, has led to some ideas of collusion between platforms and governments and academia and fact checkers in ways that actually has been really unhelpful to the field. And just number 5, not thinking about the connections between online and offline. We still talk all the time about the problem being on platforms, particularly Facebook. We still don't talk enough about YouTube. We're starting to talk more about TikTok, but what's happening in all sorts of other spaces of where rumors are circulating, whether that's at the school gate, whether it's in community centers, whether it's in churches, whether it's pamphlets that are coming through the doors, we still don't have a good way of thinking about offline problematic content, for want of a better word, and we certainly don't understand how this content moves across the digital ecosystem and offline as well. And finally, and this is something that I'm doing a lot more work on, if you look for bad stuff on the internet, you can find it. And I would argue that our field has spent 6 years writing reports about all the bad stuff on the internet. And we all got those reports and went, oh, there's a lot of bad stuff on the internet. But actually, my frustration is I think it was easier to look at communities of disinformation and really focus on the people who believe that Bill Gates was microchipping them, or the kind of the really bad stuff. But what we failed to do was look at the 80% of people who were just confused, overwhelmed, couldn't find good information to answer their questions. We didn't look enough, I don't think, at poor government communications. Sometimes journalism itself hasn't necessarily done a good enough job at meeting community information needs. So I think when we think about the whole information ecosystem, we have disproportionately focused on the really bad conspiratorial stuff that drives the headlines, it drives the funders. We haven't helped the mother who's like, should I vaccinate my son? I've heard something about myocarditis, but I've gone online and it's confusing and I don't know. That, I think, is the thing that we have to focus more on when we think about misinformation. So that was my essay.
Thank you so much. Yes, I found it really fascinating and very honest, coming from somebody who's in this profession. Chairman Wheeler, I'd love for you to go next and tee us up with your essay on the need for an open internet. I expected that this was going to be the topic you wrote and spoke on, and indeed you did. Chairman Wheeler, I think you're on mute, so yep.
There we go. You know, the expression for the 21st century is "you're on mute." It's a privilege to be in this group, Issie and Michael. Thank you very much. After listening to Alex and Suresh and Claire, I'm tempted to go, check, please. You know, and listening to the challenges that they have outlined so well. But, you know, if you peel back those challenges, it all goes back to our networks. How is it that all of these kinds of activities are enabled? And we have failed to deal with our networks. And that needs to be a predicate for how we deal with the broader issues as well. You can't, what we've come up with is a situation where you have a network layer that is supposed to be open, on top of which was built a closed layer. And we've got to deal with the first one in order to get to the second one. And that's why when we went to, in 2015, to pass the open internet rule at the FCC, everybody called this net neutrality. And we said, no, no, no. This is an open internet order, that it is essential for networks to be open and non-discriminatory, which is not a revolutionary concept. 12th century, as we were coming out of feudalism, as Western society was coming out of feudalism, common law developed, and one of the basic concepts of common law was a duty to deal. The guy who ran the ferry across the river that was an essential network had a duty to let everybody on. It used to be, oh no, I'll only let my lord's friends on, or his products on. And that kind of concept evolved as technology evolved. When the railroad came along, railroads had to be open and non-discriminatory. When the telegraph came along, telegraph had to be open and non-discriminatory. When the telephone came along, same story. But lo and behold, we come to the internet, which frankly would not have existed if in those early NSF and DARPA applications, the telephone network wasn't open and forced to carry the digital information. But we get to this new network, this new increasingly essential network. And what happens? The industry throws up its hand and says, oh no, this can't possibly be open. And they want to close it down and make their own rules. So we put the open internet rules in place. But my point is, and we'll talk more about this, I hope, as we go on, it's much more than net neutrality. For instance, let's go to Alex's point about privacy. You can't get to privacy on the network unless you have a nexus to oversee that network. And that's what was going on when we said in the open internet order, you need to treat these networks as Title II under the Communications Act, common carriers, where you have authority to deal with things like this. So open is both access to and what happens on the network. And we have failed ever since the Trump administration to have policies to deal with that. We just saw Gigi Sohn have to survive and ultimately withdraw from a scurrilous attack to keep her from being the 5th FCC commissioner that would have reinstated an open internet requirement. Clearly, the companies want to keep that from happening. But then lastly, and I'll shut up and we'll have look forward to a discussion. What we've been saying all along for the network is that there has to be a referee on the field. There has to be somebody who can say, no, we're going to have public safety expectations. No, we're going to have privacy expectations. No, we're going to have access expectations, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need to have a referee on the field for those pseudo networks that are the superstructures that are then built on top of this wonderful thing called the internet. And that requires, I go back to what Suresh was talking about, where he said, where there was airplanes or automobiles or food processing or whatever, the government always stepped in and said, in a capitalistic environment, there is always incentive to excess. And I'm a capital C capitalist. Let's make no mistake about that. Okay. But we need to have a countervailing force. We need to establish guardrails. And what are the rules? And those rules cannot be made up by the companies themselves. I saw an NBC clip from over the weekend of Eric Schmidt being interviewed by NBC, in which he was saying quite explicitly, government isn't smart enough to oversee AI, and the only hope for AI oversight is the companies themselves. To which I would say, well, how's that done for us thus far on the internet and the platforms that use the internet and the attacks on our privacy and the destruction of competition and I'm now going to use a Claire Wardle term, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, a word that I learned from her, that exists and we do nothing about. So I think we got to start with the networks, but we've got to move forward and deal with the concept that that Suresh was raising, which is that there need to be broad rules establishing guardrails for the operation of this new and exciting technology.
Thank you so much. Thank you all four of you for setting us up so nicely here. Alex, I'm going to come back to you. So part of your essay, talks about areas where there has been some emerging consensus, areas like, requiring some sort of transparency around content moderation, areas around privacy, or even, some of the self-regulatory efforts by companies to crack down on, inauthentic coordinated activity. But we're in this moment where it feels like AI is creating a million new types of threats, or at least they sort of feel new, even if they have like long roots. And it can kind of make some of these discussions around like, sort of like what Claire was saying about like, oh, how much bad stuff did you take down last month? Put it in your transparency report. It can kind of make some of those discussions feel like fighting last year's war. And so I guess I wonder, what do you think about that? Are those issues, content moderation, transparency, privacy, are those the foundational issues that we still need to be focusing on in this moment? Or are there sort of new fronts on which we need to be addressing these threats?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a live one, right? For a civil society organization with finite resources, you have to choose your priorities and your battles, and we have to have policymakers do the same thing. But I really do think the answer is we need to be doing all of these pieces, and we can't get distracted by just the newest shiny object or the newest headline and lose the fundamentals to make sure that we're actually addressing, to Chairman Wheeler's point, the fundamentals of network access, fundamental issues which we've been fighting about for over 25 years around people's basic right to have their data privacy protected. The ongoing conversations around content moderation and how we deal with ongoing issues around platform governance. So I think the answer is we need to do all of the above. One of the pieces in the AI conversation that I think can get a little frustrating for those of us in this space, and Suresh, you and I have talked a lot about this, is the notion that these issues are brand new and that we need to suddenly drop everything and just have a conversation around generative AI. The reality is, AI is having a dramatic impact on people's civil rights, their access to economic opportunities today, their access to public benefits. AI is being used to detect fraud, to kick people out of programs. It's being used to help decide who gets a job. It's being used to target housing ads to people, which goes to questions of who gets access to housing in what places. And it is really easy to forget that those systems are already in play and that we have existing tools to go after them. So to me, that doesn't mean we don't need to talk about generative AI and the real concerns of what it means for our information ecosystem, turbocharging some of the questions Claire's talked about, but we have to do both. One of the things that I come back to is our fundamentals, right? So we need to have regulators know how to apply their existing authorities to these spaces, even when the fact patterns are new. So I spend a lot of time, Suresh spends a lot of time with the civil rights agencies, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the FTC. All of them have authorities that can map onto this new world, and they can be doing a real kind of piece of that and moving that conversation forward. And then we need to think about what additional tools fit in here. Chairman Wheeler raises a really powerful point here about, industry self-reg not being enough. One of the main reasons why it's not enough, or even existing laws aren't enough, is that people don't even know when they're the subject of an AI decision-making tool, or how AI tools are being used to actually be able to apply existing authorities, or whether industry is kind of self-regulating in an appropriate way. So there are information asymmetries that Congress needs to be able to step in and address. This is why we need a lot of people at the table. It's why we need democracy and other places talking about these questions. And Congress just has to start acting, has to start chipping away at these nonpartisan issues that impact people all across society to show that we can have a grown-up conversation and move the dialogue forward.
No, I was on mute. I think that is a really important point, that generative AI is not causing brand new problems. AI is already embedded in so many systems impacting people's lives. Claire, I do want to talk to you though about, its impact on the information ecosystem, since that is sort of your bread and butter. The reason we need people like you in the first place is because it's really hard to sometimes know what's real, what's not, the provenance of information, all of that. How has this moment changed your job, changed the field? What new approaches do people in your profession need to take to respond to the impact on information?
More press requests. No. I think that's the problem, right? Is it's very easy to write the headline, which is like, oh my God, we have to be scared. And as we know, the bigger challenge to some of this is that it will allow people to say, oh, that's not real. It's a deep fake, even when it is. I have to say, when Elliot Higgins made as kind of a joke the photos of Trump being arrested, like, it didn't cause a big scandal. Like, people weren't shocked. They weren't shocked that the Pope was wearing a puffer jacket. Actually, all of these conversations means that people are smarter. My concern, though, is when we're going to have the mixture of personalization mixed in with AI. So things like personalized robocalls, which means that I'm on somebody knows me, I get a robocall because of who I am. So I think we haven't yet seen the stuff that I really am worried about. And I think that goes to the guardrail stuff, which is there are other ways that we've come up with regulations around those kind of things, particularly around things like elections. So the bits where we think, where could AI really, really make a problem? Conflict, elections, and other things. So I think we have to continue to just talk with people about what this means. And I think that does get back to the literacy piece. And I think the conversations over the last 5 years have made people more savvy. I think we have to stop with the headlines of like, we're all going to die. And I think we just have to start the conversations, as we just heard from Alex, of here are all the other ways that AI is affecting you right now. And this is why you've sent in 200 resumes and not had a callback. Let's talk about that. Like, those are the conversations I'm not seeing headlines about. And I think is the bit that's much more chilling.
And just sticking with you, Claire, for a minute, because you brought this up in your introduction, and you and I were talking about it, is this moment is coinciding with this huge backlash against researchers in your space. We saw it through, the Twitter files, the idea that like any recommendation from academics and researchers, think tanks, to a company like Twitter was somehow, massive censorship in collusion with the government. We've seen it in the backlash against the Disinformation Governance Board and, researchers getting buried under subpoenas and records requests. I'd love to hear more from you about how this is impacting your work, what kind of chilling effect it's having, not just on you, but on others in your field right now.
Yeah, it's serious. There's a weaponization of transparency tools like FOIs that are meaning that researchers are being tied up with these kind of mechanisms. And I think, again, I'm just going to say this, it might not be very popular, but the speed at which this field grew, the fact that we were doing this work in the context of really deeply worrying moments. There were 2 or 3 years there where many of us simply didn't sleep and spent all day looking at terrible things on the internet, and it had really serious mental health tolls on everybody. But things like, how do we label something when science is evolving? What do we say now when actually in 6 months' time, the science changes and what we said was misinformation wasn't? We did things that really undermined some of this work. We didn't stop and think about some of these things. which I think has left us vulnerable to the kind of attacks we're seeing now. But ultimately, the deep frustration is that we're trying to figure this stuff out, that the internet has supercharged this moment. And I wish that we had time to sit around. I mean, one of my frustrations about these kind of multi-stakeholder meetings is you have journalists, you have librarians, you never have my mum. Like we don't have users around the table being like, this is how I feel when I see a label. This is what I think is misinformation. This is the stuff that I think is harmful. Like, what are the social norms around speech? And I think there's this right now, this argument that there was collusion between academics and fact checkers with the platforms. Instead, it was the platforms had policies, and there were many of us who were trying to help the platforms that we knew were underfunded, we knew didn't have enough content moderators, and they weren't able to do what they were promising. So of course, as ever, the platforms are not getting attacked now. It's kind of the poor civil society and the academics who are now being attacked for just trying to help at the time. But it is that there has been a real chilling effect to a lot of work. A lot of people are now saying, I have to spend all day responding to FOI requests, or I can't get funding anymore, or my university feels nervous about doing this kind of work. And I think there are some tactics right now for this specifically to be the case, to shut down some of these initiatives ahead of 2024, and we need to name that. So there's just deep sadness from me at this point. Yeah, I can see where we made some missteps, but what's happening is that we have fewer people thinking deeply about these questions, about speech that's causing harm to real people. And that's the headline that we're not necessarily hearing.
Right. And it seems like it is coming out at the worst possible time for that to happen. Suresh, you brought up the AI Bill of Rights blueprint, and Alex was talking about, we can't just focus on the shiny new object. We need to kind of focus on fundamentals. Can you talk a little bit about how the principles laid out in that blueprint might address some of the big issues that people are sort of waking up to now around generative AI?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've actually been thinking a lot about that of late, because I spent a lot of time in the trenches when, our goal was the rhetoric we were dealing with was that AI was somehow inhuman. It could do things we could not. It could make predictions about behavior that we could not. It could decide who should get a loan or who should get a job in a way better and in a superior way than humans could. And then we started poking at those claims one by one and realizing the extent to which they were in fact not true. And it happened because we dug deep into the tools, into the methods that people were using. Journalists exposed the tools that were being used. To Alex's point, if you don't know they're being used, you can't ask questions about them. And then the whole army of researchers and advocates poking into how these tools worked, identified all the different problems that they had. And in some sense, the blueprint itself, the AI Bill of Rights, is a reflection on many, many years of work unpacking and mapping out all the ways in which AI, when deployed in people impacting settings, were causing harms, and what kind of protections we need to make sure that these harms don't get replicated. And so that's making sure systems are tested, that they actually work before we put them out there. Seems like a small thing to ask, but in fact, it doesn't happen enough. Making sure that systems don't discriminate, that they don't indiscriminately use our data and sell it all over the place. This is privacy, and is even more than that. That systems are visible to us, that we know that a system is being used, and that we understand to some degree why it's making the decisions it makes. And that above all, when systems fail, as they tend to, these technological systems, that we have recourse, we have alternatives, we have human alternatives and consideration for when these systems fail us, as they often do. And that's the blueprint right there in a nutshell. It may be, it's not, one paragraph long and it's 70 pages long, because not only did we articulate those principles, we gave a detailed description of how to go about making sure that systems that are built can be protected against causing harm. I mean, there were computer scientists in the room developing this. And the whole point was to write it in a way that a developer at a company could read it and say, okay, these are the kinds of checks they need to put into place. So that was the vision, and that is the vision for the Bill of Rights. And I am happy to see that states across the country are building legislation for AI governance modeled off the blueprint. And Alex talked about the regulatory bodies. They came out very strongly saying that they can, in fact, use existing laws in the books to regulate algorithmic sort of systems that could potentially be discriminating. And moreover, that they're putting out new guidelines. The EOC has put out guidelines, for example, on the use of algorithmic systems in hiring to prevent discrimination under the ADA. So I'm happy to see all of that, but we clearly need more of it. Now, you asked about generative AI. It's really the same thing, right? We now have a new set of tools built, in fact, on the same kinds of models and even a narrower set of models from deep learning that are claiming to do something. They claim to be human. They claim to be, conversational. They claim to sort of answer all our questions in a way that Google search cannot. These are claims. We can evaluate these claims. We can look into how these systems are being built. And researchers it's only been 6 months, but researchers are already beginning to understand the way in which ChatGPT fails, the way in which it can be broken by appropriate, prompts given to it. There's an article of faith in computer science. It's not well known outside the field, right? That the best way to understand the power of a system is to understand its limits, to understand where it breaks. And there's a formal mathematical way of saying this. We talk about the formal limits on what an algorithm can do. And that helps us understand what it can and cannot do. It helps us shape what a system can do and where it can be used and where it cannot be used. People are beginning to do that now for generative AI. It's only been a few months since ChatGPT came out, but it's been a few years since researchers have been poking at these systems. And they do understand where some of the limits are. And I think it's important, again, as Claire said, to not panic and not be afraid, but to methodically go about doing the same kind of dissection analysis of these systems that we did with the AI systems used to make decisions about people. And we will find, I suspect, many of the same issues, that these systems need to be tested, that they need to be measured to be effective in the context in which they are used. If you insist, which I think is not a good idea, insist on using a chatbot in a hotline, a medical hotline, it better well be tested rigorously to make sure it makes sense. And again, I'm not even sure I think that's a good idea. So that's a whole other story. And that they should not, amplify biases, which we know they would do without any further, and we know they already do, these generative AI systems. And that they are transparent and explainable. They are very, very far from that right now. And that's not going to be another issue. So all these principles, I think, still apply, and they apply in spades to these new systems. I don't think they are fundamentally different in that respect.
Chairman Wheeler, you called in your essay and a little bit in your intro for the creation of a digital platform agency to police that sort of upper layer of online platforms. And obviously a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, misinformation, algorithmic bias and discrimination, all of that manifests on those platforms. I'm wondering what you think, given what we've heard from Alex, what we've heard from Suresh about the role that existing agencies have in policing some of that stuff. What do you envision this new agency would do that other agencies can't, or what new function would it serve?
Well, first of all, hooray for what Suresh did with the AI Bill of Rights. Hooray for what Lena Khan is trying to do at the Federal Trade Commission. The challenges that government has in dealing with these 21st century issues is that they're working on 19th century statutes. And, the challenge, the Communications Act that I had to deal with was written in 1934. The television was not imagined, let alone the internet. And so the question becomes not how do we go in and say, how do I bolt something on to an existing agency that has to live with the muscle memory that is already in that agency? But how do I create an agency that has the expertise in this specific area and the focus and a different set of regulatory tools? The headline is always that we've called for a digital platform agency or digital platform commission. Yes, that's correct. But we need to have the administration of that agency operate in a way that works by 21st century management techniques rather than those that worked in the Industrial Revolution. So for instance, how did we get from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G in wireless and now working on 6G? It was a process of standards setting that continued to evolve as the technology evolved and the marketplace evolved. That is the antithesis of, hello, I'm from the government, and this is the way I am going to micromanage your activity. And so long as we keep thinking in terms of the old style industrial era utility regulation, we are going to give those, like the Eric Schmidt interview, those folks who don't want any regulation, the tool to beat us with, because they'll say, oh, it's too rigid. You can't do that. You will destroy innovation. You will destroy investment. Okay, let's come up with a tool, a regulatory oversight tool that replicates the way they manage the companies themselves with an agile, ever-evolving response to the realities of both the technology and the marketplace. And until we get to that kind of a discussion, I worry that we will be stuck in a situation where we've been for the last multiple decades. That, you know, the internet didn't come on, the internet did come on us as a surprise. But as the discussion here has shown, AI did not come on us as a surprise. And we've had time to think about it. We've had time to understand what the impact of an interconnected, low-cost computing means on society. And we need to come up with a way of overseeing that that is more flexible than the rigid rules base. And that means you go back to the kinds of things that Suresh was talking about, that they were focusing on in the AI Bill of Rights, and that is focus on the effects and identify what are the risks and how am I going to deal with it. One last point, and I want to go back. Suresh was talking about this. When the EEOC and the FTC and the DOJ and the CFPB all a couple of weeks ago said, we're going to oversee what happens with AI in our space. Hooray for them. Lena Khan had the great line of all time, there is no AI exemption in the law. Absolutely right. The problem is she's talking about the law that exists today.
Right.
And the FTC Act was written in 1914. And what we need is a law that recognizes the reality of the digital environment in which we exist and creates a structure for dealing with that reality, rather than forcing us to take 21st century realities and put them into 19th and 20th century boxes.
I think that's a good case for it. Alex, I wanted to bring you in and just so everybody knows, we might go a couple minutes over because we've talked a lot about domestic policy, but I think as Alex mentioned, you know, there's an international component to this as well that I think we should be digging into, which you brought up in your introduction, you know, talking about the surveillance of Iranian protesters. And just this weekend, we saw Twitter capitulate to the Turkish government on a request to censor content related to the election at the government's request. So, you know, Alex, this is something that CDT works on a lot. What role is there for the US government to push back against authoritarian uses of US tech companies? Is there a role? Does it have any ground to stand on, you know, given tensions between the US government and these tech companies?
Yeah, so that news over the weekend and kind of other changes that we've seen is just a really important encapsulation of one of the trends that Claire was talking about, which is even where it felt like we were making gains in pushing back on mis and disinformation, on abuses of some platforms, it feels like there are places where we've seen real steps backwards. And the announcement by Twitter that they were going to capitulate to demands from the Turkish government to remove content is just another example of that. That is something that in the past, Twitter was really good and strong about pushing back on those pressure, and not just in Turkey. We saw it in India and other countries around the world where they took a stand for international human rights and said, you know, we will weather the consequences, including if that is a temporary shutdown of our services. We're going to call the question and have the government that is bullying us in this way have to navigate those domestic politics, or even in places where Twitter employees were threatened with litigation or imprisonment, which actually has happened in some regimes as well. In terms of a role for the US government itself, that is hard. Diplomatic pressure is one of the ways to go, but obviously that comes with its own complexities. But this is an example of why in this space we need companies leading. And when these are US companies, you know, the people that Twitter are most likely to listen to these days, it does seem to be US market forces, if nothing else, right? And so that's where, even if it's not completely satisfying, we do need to be looking to US advertisers, the people that do have influence over the executive decision-making at Twitter, to ask them to really be taking a stand for human rights. Because I tell you, the dissidents in Turkey are not going to have leverage to push back in these circumstances. And so democratic nations and leaders within democratic society need to speak out as well.
I was going to kick to you, Claire, but she tells me her dogs are going crazy right now, so I'm not going to call on her. So Suresh, I had one other question for you while Claire's dogs calm down. You know, there is this congressional push right now on the subject of AI. And I think a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing coming out of Majority Leader Schumer's office and elsewhere is that, you know, we need to get ahead of AI while also protecting American innovation. And maybe I'm a little cynical, but when I hear that, I hear, you know, we want our companies to be as uninhibited as possible because there's this global race, and some of our adversaries are going to get this technology before we do. Does that scare you at all in terms of, you know, the U.S. government's willingness to, you know, impose some of the guardrails, some of the friction that you might like to see, because, you know, they are wary of inhibiting American innovation?
It's a tough situation because just within the last 2 months even, we've seen what happens when you have a race to the bottom with just OpenAI and Google and other tech companies, after years of proclaiming proudly that they had ethics organizations, that they had organizations thinking about responsible AI, which they then fired one by one, starting with Timnit and her team, and then had a major layoff of their ethics groups in early January, rapidly raced to the bottom in terms of deployment of generative AI systems. So even within, you know, the microcosm of the US tech industry, you see this race to the bottom as a result of the fear of getting beaten to the trophy, I guess, of more money. So I think what's ironic about this now is that if we set aside, it's a complicated issue to look at, for example, what China is doing, because that is often the bugbear that's sort of held out. But if you, to the extent that you can look at some of the discussions happening within China around regulation, there's actually a lot more aggressive regulation of AI systems within China. Now, again, their motives are different, their structure is different. I'm not going to, you know, say that that is a model to adopt, but it is not the case that China is not regulating, or let me say this in a more positive way. They are, in fact, putting explicit regulations on generative AI, on recommendation systems, again, for their own interests, but they're doing it. And so, you know, and so is the EU. So I think there is a lot of interest in putting some kind of governance structure on AI. So I don't think we need to worry about holding back. And I do want to say one more thing about innovation. I find this innovation argument very strange as a computer scientist. I frankly think the tech industry is fearful and has lost its imagination to think that the only way to innovate is to ignore the, frankly, very interesting challenges of building responsible systems with guardrails. I teach this work, I do research in the space, This is one of the most fast growing areas in computer science right now. How to build systems that have safeguards, that have protections, that have mitigations for bias in them. People are building careers on how to do this kind of work. It's an exciting space, a new space. There's a lot of innovation here. And I don't know what these tech companies are talking about when they say that they need to preserve the right not to build these systems to preserve innovation. It's the opposite. If they were to innovate on building guardrails, we could set the example for the entire world, and that would be great. The best innovation is happening here. Of course, they fired everyone who's doing this work, so it's kind of hard for them to do it, and maybe others have to do it too. But there's a lot of innovation just in building guardrails, and we should lean into that.
Izzy, can I pile on there for a
Yes,
second?
I was going to kick it to you next anyway. Go ahead.
I think Suresh has a terrific point. There is a knee-jerk, a corporate knee-jerk. Anytime anybody says something about regulation, the immediate response is, oh, you're going to impact innovation and investment. And the answer is, how did they get to those innovative points in the first place? For the most part, all of us paid for them, right? One of the things I talk about in the article, the frog didn't get on the fence post by itself. Everything that is in your smartphone, all the major breakthroughs in your smartphone were paid for and developed by the US taxpayer. So point one is they have been the beneficiary of intrusion into innovation. Second of all is what we need to have is a structure that says, how do I do oversight in a responsible way? And as Suresh was just saying, and I think Alex also brought up, we're in a situation right now where the rest of the world's going to write the rules. And we're going to be sitting here in an interconnected world where the rules that are made by the EU, our friends in the EU, or maybe our less than friends in China and elsewhere, are the rules that become de facto in the US market because we haven't stepped up with our own set of rules. And you can't engage in developing rules that work for everybody unless you've said to yourself, well, what do I believe? What are my rules? And we have decided, no, we're just going to sit back. And there will be consequences of this to American consumers and to American corporations that are today arguing against any rules.
I think that's a really good place to end it. A warning to anybody listening or a call to action to anybody listening. Thank you so much to everybody who tuned in. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I feel very lucky to have been part of this smart crew today. And I guess tune in next time for the next volume of Democracy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye.